Welcome to the Clinical Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, we are able to make science more accessible and understandable.
Welcome, everyone, to the May 2024 edition of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club podcast. Special thank you again to our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, for making it possible for us to be here together today. I'm Remley Crow. Today, I'm joined by Michael Caduce and Jeff Rollman, and we will be talking about a paper called Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest Outcomes When Law Enforcement Arrives Before Emergency Medical Services, and this is hot off the press from Resuscitation. As always, our discussion is going to be paired with an article written by our very own columnist, Michael Caduce. It's in EMS World called Journal Watch. I encourage all of you listeners to check it out. It is at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. And thank you for all who are joining us here live. As we begin, I just want to remind you, you can use your chat feature on the screen to type in questions and comments, and we can bring those into the conversation with us as we go. So without further ado, let's dive into this one because there's a lot of exciting things to talk about. And first, before we dive into any research paper, I think it's important that we have a couple of things in mind. One, what were the authors trying to accomplish? And two, why is it important? So Michael, maybe you can kick us off with a little bit of the introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. This article came through on Resuscitation. Actually, was really excited to sort of send it around to everybody and see what their thoughts were. But when we start looking at sort of like operationally on a cardiac arrest, almost always law enforcement beats the ambulance there. They're out in the community. And there's really not a whole lot to say, does that have a huge benefit? And I think more recently, we've seen pushes to put AEDs in law enforcement and police cars. And does that have a benefit, right? Those are costly. There's, training is, involved there. So does it make a big difference? And I think if we look at what the authors were trying to answer, is there a benefit to the patient in having a law enforcement personnel arrive on scene and then sort of stratify for what their actions were when they arrived? And I think that's a great question. Is there a benefit to sending a law enforcement officer to a cardiac arrest? Is there a benefit to having them do high quality CPR? And is there a benefit to having them put the AED on the patient? Those are not questions that we've explored in great detail in the past. There's plenty of cardiac arrest literature, but less about who's arriving, when they're arriving, and specifically what they're doing when they get there. So that's, I think, really why this study looks good to me. It's also, when we get into the methods, it's also got some unique methods that I think sort of saying true. I always like when people get creative.
Absolutely. And this for me brings to mind a phrase that it gets said a lot, especially when it comes to cardiac arrest, but I think it is true, is that it takes a system to save a life. And here, I like that this article is exploring beyond just the EMS response and looking at this holistically from a systems lens on, we haven't really seen major improvements in cardiac arrest survival in about a decade, but are there other levers we can pull? Could we change the system to get a different result? And one of those things that we might be able to change is having law enforcement provide the bystander resuscitation until EMS arrives in systems where law enforcement is likely to arrive before EMS.
I agree.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yes, I was going to say at this point, we've definitely established that bystander CPR is super beneficial. And really, we need that bystander CPR in order to have our best outcomes. But so much of the data and studies that we've seen, it's really hard to figure out who these bystanders are. And then when we get a first responder there that's not the ultimate kind of transporting or ALS crew, is that the fire department? Is that the police department? Is it some other agency? Who exactly is it? And we know that bystanders are good, but doesn't matter what type of bystander. So I was really excited to see this study that they were able to disentangle these different pieces. And yeah, I think the authors did a great job really honing in and using all those different data elements that aren't necessarily included in the basic registries that we'll talk about soon.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that is an important call out, is that this work builds on previous work where it wasn't easy to separate out the type of first response. So was it a fire EMS agency or was it police, for instance? So this is really one of the first looks at that disentangled who was first response and how long, before EMS got there. So in order to understand this, though, before we dive into results, I think it's worth spelling out some of the methods and thinking about where this took place, where is it likely to generalize to, if anywhere. And so you mentioned that data source, and the data source for this was unique in that it has outcome data and high quality outcome data at that. So this study was conducted in Portland, Oregon, using the Portland Cardiac Arrest Epidemiologic Registry, or the PDX Epistry. And this is a really cool data set that I had not heard of before, but it is a prospective, meaning that the data get collected as we go forward. Cardiac Arrest Registry out of Portland, which consists of 4 counties, 16 EMS agencies, and 16 receiving facilities. And so for the present study, the authors used 3 of those counties, which were Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas. And the years that encompass this study, which is important to pay attention to, were 2018 through 2021. Now, given that some things happened in 2020 and 2021, we probably want to have this lens on and say, oh, wow, we would love to see this study conducted now, obviously, and potentially think through, were there any changes in our response patterns during COVID that maybe this study also reflects? So a couple of things to keep in mind. Another important aspect of this is thinking through the system that is present. This was dual ALS response, which is unique, to some areas, meaning that they have an ALS fire first model, and generally that fire first is not a transporting unit, though sometimes it can be. And then an ALS private unit shows up that is capable of transport. And law enforcement is also simultaneously dispatched, but not necessarily required to respond in all cases of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. So first things first, as this is not a randomized study, we should be thinking about what might be different about encounters where law enforcement was dispatched, and not only that, where law enforcement got on scene before EMS. So just a couple of things to think through in the study design and setting component. And then we move into our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So who was in the study, starting with all adult patients, 18 and older, who had a cardiac arrest in the out-of-hospital setting. They excluded traumatic circulatory arrest, interfacility transports, and EMS witness cardiac arrest, which I think that was a smart and a really critical decision, because obviously it's very different if EMS is present when the cardiac arrest occurs versus not. And then any records where there was notation of a DNR or a response that occurred at a healthcare facility. And within healthcare facility, they included nursing homes. And I believe that the logic behind this exclusion is that, well, there's going to be a higher likelihood of having trained staff on scene to start that bystander CPR, and a higher likelihood that an AED would be present anyway. And then also, to that same thought, they excluded where bystanders had already put on an AED. And with that, we should explore their measures a little bit. So the primary independent variable of interest here was law enforcement being present, but not just law enforcement being present. The authors broke this into 3 groups. So they have law enforcement was on scene, but did not perform CPR or apply an AED. And they call that the law enforcement on scene only group. And then there's a group where law enforcement provided CPR, but did not apply an AED. So law enforcement CPR only. And then they have a group that they call ideal care. And this is the cohort that got law enforcement CPR and law enforcement applied an AED. The comparison group was all out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients meeting the same exclusions, where law enforcement was not documented as being on scene. And then they did something that I think is pretty cool. They picked out what variables do we want to adjust for, or what are our confounding variables. and they used a process known as a directed acyclic graph. And we haven't talked about that a lot on this podcast, but I think it is an approach worth talking about because generally we talk about confounding variables and we know that there are these things that are associated with our primary independent variable and they're also associated with our outcome. And we want to get rid of them so that they don't confuse the effects. But being thoughtful about how those relationships play out is really important in this one, especially because the authors mentioned something called the causal path. And could there be things that are on the causal path? So I'm going to show an example of what a directed acyclic graph looks like, just to give a little bit of an image in mind. So on a directed acyclic graph, for those who can't see a slide, what we have is on our left is our primary independent variable. And this example one that I'm giving is looking at the relationship between physical activity and atrial fibrillation as the outcome. So we have our primary independent variable and our outcome. And then we think about what things are associated with both of these and in what direction. So for example, there's the hypertension. Does hypertension cause physical activity? Maybe it causes me to get up and think that I need to go have more physical activity, but it's probably more likely that physical activity can mitigate the effects of hypertension, and hypertension surely is related to atrial fibrillation. So if it goes, the arrows come from physical activity to hypertension, from hypertension then to the outcome, we can say that's on the causal pathway. And in the example, the authors say that they did not put into their model initial rhythm. And we might think, oh my goodness, how could they not have controlled for initial rhythm? But their argument is that initial rhythm is on the causal pathway, that if law enforcement does ideal care, CPR and an AED, it's more likely that that person's going to be in a shockable initial rhythm. And then, of course, their outcome being survival neurologically intact would be affected by whether or not that patient was in that shockable rhythm. So that's just to say, this is just one approach for identifying confounding variables, but I think it is unique and it's a really great way of thinking through the relationships and not potentially adjusting away something that could be an important effect. So they put some thought into this, they based their findings on the literature, and they built their models in that way rather than just letting the statistical software tell them what variables should go in or out. And then again, outcomes here, it's important to think about primary versus secondary outcomes. So primary outcome, again, I really like what the authors did here. They picked a patient-centered measure, which is survival to hospital discharge with a good neurological outcome. And they define that good neurological outcome as a CPC score less than or equal to 2. And I think we've talked about these cerebral performance scores before. But this is a great way of not just assessing survival or not, but survival with or without serious deficit. And then secondarily, they looked at some other important measures, and it is important to have some secondary measures because one can argue, well, sometimes survival to discharge is so far from the EMS encounter that a bunch of other things took place during that time. And so can we really relate that to what EMS did, or is that more of a reflection of what happened at the hospital? And so they did put in some other outcomes as their secondary measures, and that was ROSC at ED arrival, general survival to hospital admission, and general survival to hospital discharge. And so we'll be looking out for those as we move into the results. Last but not least, we should always talk about the analysis strategy and how did they approach this. The primary analysis was a multivariable logistic regression model. And not only this, that model obviously included the things in their directed acyclic graph that they thought could potentially affect the independent variable in the outcome, but they accounted for clustering because they included 3 different counties in the study, and county response, county protocols, all might be similar within. So it was really important that they made this choice of let's adjust for clustering using a special type of logistic regression model called mixed effects. So I won't dwell on that too much. But we've talked about logistic regression before and how we use it to adjust for confounding variables, and we use it to estimate odds ratios, in this case, primary outcome still being survival neurologically intact. So let's move into some results. I know that's what we're actually here for. The statistician understands. First things first is how many patients were included in this study, and is this a big enough sample that we should have more or less confidence in it? That's always one of the first things I look at when I'm reading a research paper. And so their figure 1 is a great diagram to take a look at. and work through who got excluded and how might this affect the study results. So let's start high on the top of this figure 1. They had 3,800-ish patients who met the criteria of being EMS resuscitated adult out of hospital cardiac arrest patient. They went on to exclude those cardiac arrest events that occurred within healthcare facilities or nursing homes, which was 433, so not a huge proportion of those. They excluded another 400 patients who had their arrest witnessed by EMS. And they excluded 175 where EMS had documented DNR, do not resuscitate order. Another 81 were excluded because a bystander had applied an AED. I think that's an important point to lock onto, as well as what is the rate of bystander AED application, and might there be a system improvement there, but that's just a side note. Another 33 cardiac arrests were excluded because we didn't capture law enforcement being on scene or some of the other variables in the study. And that is potentially an important thought for us too, is how are we capturing whether or not law enforcement was on scene? A lot of this currently takes place in the free text narrative, right? And then 67 arrests were excluded because either they didn't have one of the main outcomes or the secondary outcomes, which again, I look at that and I'm like, wow, that's not a huge number, especially when you're talking about getting the hospital data. So the authors really did a lot of great work here, and you know, that's a big feat in and of itself. And then 44 arrests were missing some of the other variables that were part of the model, and those were excluded. So again, this is a relatively complete data set where not a ton of missing data was present that resulted in exclusions. Ultimately, over 2,500 patients were included in the analysis. And we can see, if you look at the very bottom of figure 1, the vast majority of these did not have any documentation of law enforcement on scene before EMS. And so that's something also for us to keep in mind as we think about the N, or as we think about the size of these buckets or cohorts, as the authors call them.
I think really important to note is your authors made a really good choice here in your top 2 exclusion criteria. It would be easy for an author to say, let's include that data set because we need a bigger N, but to really say we don't think this answers our study question, to me really hits home the author's true intent here, which is to look at the law enforcement specific impact on the cardiac arrest. So it just is like, those are sometimes easy or hard decisions to make when doing your methods. So applaud the authors for making that decision to say this doesn't answer our study question, and it's definitely gonna, I mean, it decreased your N by about 20%. So I think that's huge.
Absolutely.
And speaking of the exclusions too, as you had mentioned, Dr. Crow, that only 67 arrests were excluded because of those missing outcomes. I was shocked to see such a small number. I mean, we know that those actual outcomes in terms of survival to discharge and their neurologic outcome are super important, but that could often get lost in the mix, and those more distant outcomes we might not have. So this makes us think that we could definitely trust this data more, since we're losing less, and those missing patients, we don't know if they're different from the ones that aren't missing. So the fact that those missing patients are such a small percentage, also commend the authors on the strength of this registry, really having that complete data.
Yeah, and I mean, the manual labor that goes into making that data set that complete is really important. And so having these registries can add, you know, such higher quality data, whereas we might have not had this if we only been looking at a single data source without any human overview. And I think they did a great job at describing that. So moving from figure 1 into table 1, that's the next thing that we usually look at in a research paper. And this gives us a gut check on how did the different groups' characteristics measure up. So were there any really large differences between those who did and did not have law enforcement on scene? And you know, what characteristics here should we call out? So first thing that I look at is, again, at the ends, and I see, okay, 30% of these records had law enforcement on scene at any time, but 15% of those were before EMS arrived. So it wasn't necessarily uncommon that EMS and law enforcement arrived at the similar time, or law enforcement came after EMS. But there is this opportunity with 15% of encounters having law enforcement as the first arriving responders. And then when we break it into these groups between the no law enforcement on scene only, no CPR, no AED, law enforcement CPR only, or law enforcement CPR and AED, which they call ideal care, we can see that law enforcement performed the CPR about 86% of the time. And importantly, law enforcement was the first to initiate CPR, meaning there was no bystander to take over CPR from about 2/3 of the time. So that right in and of itself is a finding worth reporting, saying, wow, if law enforcement hadn't been there first, then bystander CPR would have been delayed until EMS would have been the first to provide CPR, in other words. And then of the 392 cases where law enforcement did arrive before EMS, the AED got applied in 1/3 of those cases. Now we might think, well, that's not a very high number, or that can bring us into some important discussion points around how could we get that number higher? But in table 1, I think there's a telling variable here, and it's the last line of table 1, and that is the time from 911 to EMS arrival, commonly referred to as response time in many systems, was a median of 5 minutes. And then if we look at that interquartile range on these, we can see that the very upper end of the interquartile range, which is the 75th percentile, meaning 75% of responses occurred within 7 minutes. And so was there really a ton of time for law enforcement to be there first to assess and to get an AED on? Or, you hear EMS walking in the door, do we let them take over and perform the resuscitation? So that's something to keep in mind also as we say, well, maybe some of the findings here are not huge effect sizes, maybe some of them are, but thinking about what about in systems where EMS response time is going to be prolonged and law enforcement might be able to get there, 10 or 15 minutes before EMS, we could see that there might be an opportunity for much bigger effect.
I think that's huge. And I think through just responding to calls where there's a police officer on scene doing CPR, like it's really easy for me because I know exactly where the patient's at because law enforcement has been there on scene. They've located the patient. They've likely gotten the patient to a place where we could do CPR, right? They're not still stuck between the toilet and the shower. So sometimes that takes some time. So they've dealt with all of the dynamics on scene that can be locating the patient, right? Which apartment, is it the right apartment? The family dynamics or the bystander dynamics, if we're in a public location, of sort of the panic that comes. So they've done all of this and managed to get an AED in patients and in sometimes less than 5 minutes. So I agree with you. When I was initially reading this, I was like, oh, we got to fix that. There may be some opportunity for discussion there, but just the recognition of all the things that the law enforcement did before you even got there and your patient was nicely laid out in the middle of a room where you could actively do CPR, all within that short time period is huge.
Absolutely.
And then one other thing to keep in mind too with that time, since when I was looking at that at first, I was thinking, gosh, just over 5 minutes. That includes the call processing time, dispatching turnout time, wheels moving, time to actually drive there to the scene. Dang, that's fast, barely giving the police officers time to get there. But also that is just the time when they're showing up on the curb. And I'm thinking, all the times I've been in the ambulance and having to get all the gear, put everything on the stretcher, make it there inside of the house. Whereas if it's just a cop, I'm thinking much quicker to grab the AED and go inside. That even though that time seems very short, it still might, the fact that, it's that time to the actual patient, we do not have that time here. And that's something that probably is a bit longer on the EMS side than on law enforcement. So it might explain why they still can have a huge impact, even with such a short response time.
Absolutely. And I think that is telling. I really like figure 2 from this paper as well. So I want to flip over to it and give us a view, because with that systems lens, the authors do a great job at breaking down what are the different combinations of law enforcement presence for these out-of-hospital cardiac arrests, and where is there an opportunity to potentially improve systems of care, right? So at the exposed portion of the iceberg, or the tip of the iceberg, we can see that law enforcement doesn't perform CPR, but does apply an AED, and that's only 3% of the cases. And then also above the water, so to speak, in this iceberg is where law enforcement does do CPR and applies an AED, and that's 21% of the record. So that's about 1 in 5, which is pretty big. But what's underneath the water is where I also like to focus. I think this is the telling part for if we want to do continuous quality improvement projects, systems of care lens. There's 34% or about 35% of this iceberg is where law enforcement maybe starts CPR, but doesn't apply the AED. And again, we think through what are the drivers on this? Does law enforcement always have an AED present? Or is that one of the potential areas for improvement? Or is it that the response time is so short that EMS arrives before law enforcement was able to get the pads out and put them and place them? Underneath that, there's another about 9% of records where law enforcement takes over CPR from a bystander and then applies an AED. And then another 21% where law enforcement takes over CPR from a bystander, but doesn't apply the AED. So again, thinking similar drivers to that first under the water scene where law enforcement starts CPR, but does not get the AED on. And then there's a small, very, very, very buried piece of this iceberg that's about 11% of records where law enforcement was on scene, but no CPR and no AED use. And so those would, warrant their own investigation. And I think it's important to take a step back from all of this and say, none of this is to blame law enforcement or to say that, somebody acted incorrectly. It's more a lens out of curiosity. And if we're going to change the system to think about, well, what caused that scenario? Again, it could be that EMS and law enforcement arrived almost simultaneously and that it was a better option for EMS to take over right then on the scene. But there's a lot of things to dig into in this one.
I think it's really interesting too, as you talk operational considerations. When I was working with an agency just the other day, and their law enforcement had different AEDs and different pads than what their EMS did. So when EMS arrived, they were taking the pads off and putting their own pads on. Well, I could see if I was a responding law enforcement officer, every time I get there, you take my pads off. That sort of de-incentivizes me to put mine on. So we talked through all the configurations of care, even training with law enforcement. We'll get into that in the discussion, but having the same equipment, the same pads, the same plugins, and in a 4-county system, I can imagine there's some differences in the type of AED, the type of pads, the type of cardiac monitors that are being used. It's just thinking through all of the QA that comes into that to make a difference from an operational standpoint is immense.
Absolutely.
But just having all this data in the first place, I think, is a huge opportunity, since this is something, again, talking about that prior research, we have much of that data that's above the water. But with this iceberg, everything that's underwater, a lot of this isn't captured in those registries and is something that many systems might not necessarily know about. And it's hard to improve something if you don't even know where you're at in the first place. So I really commend the authors for gathering this data and being so transparent and sharing it, since none of this is necessarily bad at all. It's just we need to know where we're at so we could see where to focus some of those efforts.
Absolutely.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. So I wanted to chime in here because there's something that you said, but all of you have said, that's really important. So when I was working in Kansas, my job was the cardiac arrest registry. So to get this level of detail they have is huge manpower. And not a lot of agencies have the ability to do it. So it was a side responsibility of mine, but it could be all time consuming. And we were fortunate enough that the police in the county that I worked in were really pro wanting to have defibrillators. Not all of them, but some of the smaller ones started, and it eventually just grew from there. And, then by the time I retired, every agency, police department had an AED, but we had to do everything. Once we needed to know it was deployed, then a battalion chief would actually, that was typically on the call, would switch out. They'd give them an AED that they had so they could go back in service, so that the data could be captured off of the police department's AED. And it is just a huge amount of manpower. So this is a very impressive registry. It would be interesting almost to know more about how many people were working to make this happen.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key point. And it also provides some guidance, perhaps the national standard too. What data elements do we not capture reliably today? And might there be an opportunity to have them, not to add more boxes just to add more boxes, but to truly measure the impact of some of these systems of a care approaches, right? And you can think of other spots where this could be important too. Not too long ago, we didn't have necessarily a data element for was telecommunicator CPR provided. And then some of these study gaps were highlighted and we said, that's probably an important data element we should capture. So I think often some of this research where it can only be done with a lot of manpower in a registry setting sets the stage for potential changes to that national data standard and things that we can collect when we have our boots on the ground on scene.
Yeah, and some of it is just, and this is nothing to the providers that are out there doing their frontline work often don't understand all of the background stuff to try to make something make sense. One of the things I did when we started the early investigation with the police department is we were the secondary PSAP. And when we went to the primary PSAPs, luckily we didn't have too many, but we found out not all of them synced their clocks on their CAD to a universal clock. And that really, it brought up some interesting stuff. Dispatchers that didn't transfer calls right away. We began to really dig into it. And what we found out is that we just didn't have the manpower to hunt down to figure out how to correct these problems. The agency just wasn't, my agency that I was working for just didn't have the manpower that they could try to make this better. But it's amazing when you really look into every little parcel. And the other thing was syncing the clocks on all devices was an interesting challenge. And then I heard before is getting paramedics to do patient contact from the time they arrived to get crews to do at patient side, to capture that missing interval in there and stuff. And so it was all very fascinating.
Absolutely. And so with this and with the data that they have, let's take a look at what they found, because there's interesting breakdowns and the authors did a really great job at splitting the data in different ways and looking at the results. So table 2 is our basic descriptive table, just breaking this down in percentages and looking at the different groups in terms of the different outcomes. So when we take a look at this, and the first line here is ROSC at ED arrival, if there was no law enforcement on scene before EMS, the ROSC at emergency department arrival was 29%. Compare that to the far right column where law enforcement provided what the authors call the ideal care group. That was AED plus CPR. Now that's at 37, almost 38%. So that's a really large percentage point difference, 29 versus nearly 38. And then moving through the other outcomes, I want to just skip down to the meat of it, the good neurologic outcome. We see 11% overall, which is in line with what we've seen in the nation reports. And we've seen these in the national reports for probably about a decade now. 10% survival is about right. But when we move over to that far right column, descriptively, we see again, 16% of patients who had law enforcement ideal care met that good neurologic outcome. Then the authors break this into 2 cohorts, those who already had bystander CPR versus those who did not have bystander CPR. So, in my mind, the real opportunity here is for those patients where there was no bystander CPR, law enforcement was the first to provide it. And we can think through the reasons why there might have not been bystander CPR going on. But we can see here, going straight to the primary outcome of good neurologic outcome, when there was no bystander CPR and no law enforcement, 9% survival. Move over to the far right, we have almost double, probably more than 18.6% survival. That's a really, really, really big effect size. Now, again, it's descriptive, so take that with a grain of salt. We'll get into the adjusted analyses, but just reading through this, I'm like, wow, it seems like there's a big opportunity here. And when we see the patients who already had bystander CPR in progress, that difference is not large, and that difference isn't in favor of the law enforcement ideal care, which maybe we wouldn't expect, right? Like bystander CPR should be bystander CPR, and hopefully it's high quality, whoever's providing it, whether that be law enforcement or a different bystander. So that finding to me was not necessarily surprising or, oh, well, this means we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that really panel B of table 2 is the area where there's a huge opportunity to focus on. And so moving into the adjusted analyses, if we take a look at figure 3, that's where we get our odds ratios and our 95% confidence intervals. But thinking back to table 2 is also important because that has our ends. In general, although we started with a population of over 2,000, when you start to get into these buckets of with bystander CPR and law enforcement ideal care, those numbers start to get smaller and smaller, which as we get smaller ends, we get wider confidence intervals. But I really like how the authors chose to display this information in figure 3. This is called a forest plot. And so it shows us the odds ratio estimate, which is the dot, and then the whiskers coming out of that dot are the 95% confidence interval. And so that lets us not be stuck as 0.05 level people, meaning that, if it's P equals 0.05, then it's garbage and it means nothing. And if it's P 0.04, then wow, we should take it as the truth. This is a far better way of looking at data and making our decisions on, well, how far away from 1 is the odds ratio, and then how much of the whiskers overlap with 1. So here again, they have the 3 panels of overall, and then split out by whether or not there was bystander CPR or not. And so overall, we can see for ROSC at ED arrival, which is again, the thing that's most closely tied to the EMS event. It's not as far down the line as all the things that could happen in the hospital between, EMS arrival and then the discharge. So taking a look at ROSC, which is the first line of panel A, we can see that law enforcement ideal care was associated with a 51% increase in odds of ROSC. That's an odds ratio of 1.51. And all of that 95% confidence interval is to the right. Moving across over to the group where there's probably the biggest opportunity for impact, those who were not getting any bystander CPR and law enforcement got there before EMS, we can see that odds ratio jumps up to 1.85 for ROSC. And then in that group that was having bystander CPR, no difference. And perhaps that's expected. Again, it's probably the bystander CPR that's making a difference, not necessarily who was doing it. And then we move into some of the other outcomes. I'll go straight down to the bottom panel to not read the entire figure 3 to everyone. But I think this is, again, an important place to focus. But knowing that the bucket of people who had a good neurologic outcome is small, so we see those whiskers start to get much bigger, but there's still something to see here. So looking at the overall group, law enforcement ideal care, the confidence interval touches 1. But the estimate is to the right of 1, and most of the confidence interval is to the right of 1, favoring law enforcement ideal care. When we limit to that group where there's that big opportunity, they were not getting bystander CPR, we see a statistically significant difference. It's a 2-fold increase, an odds ratio of 2.01 for being likely to leave the hospital neurologically intact if you weren't getting any CPR, and then a law enforcement provided the ideal care CPR plus an AED. So I think that's a huge finding here. And then again, in that group that was getting bystander CPR, no difference, as would be expected, is my guess. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. And Michael, I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, I think this is demonstrating some of the value too of getting into the true meaning of your data. If we had just looked at the most left hand, if we just looked at column A and said, this is our study, we want to see if there's any impact, you would very clearly see like there's maybe some impact on ROSC to ER arrival, but nothing else really shows much impact. But when you break down your variables and when you actually start looking at what the data tells you, this whole bystander CPR concept really comes through, and our law enforcement officer being that bystander CPR demonstrates a huge impact. So I think just the value of really evaluating what your data tells you, again, it goes back to all the good points that have been made about having good data, to me just really hits home the point of some adjusted odds ratios are important, but also looking at what your data tells you. This data is telling us way more than if we had just looked at column A.
Absolutely. And within that, I see a lot of opportunity here. So, after we read a research paper, the so what, who cares, what do we do with this information? To me, this is a really motivating paper because for the first time in a long time, we see something that makes a huge difference in neurologically intact survival, not just survival, not just ROSC, right? But I love where there's an opportunity to provide this benefit. So we have huge disparities in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest outcomes. Where are some of those disparities? Well, let's think. One, for cardiac arrests that occur in homes or residences, which happen to be more often women, right? We see there's a survival gap for women. But in the case of a cardiac arrest in your home, yes, AEDs at home are becoming more of a thing, but not really, right? Now, if I can get a law enforcement officer who carries an AED in their backpack to residents first, I have an opportunity to provide that AED that might not have otherwise been there. Now, obviously, public access AEDs are more common, but this idea of cardiac arrest occurring in the home being one of the most common locations and being more prevalent among women, huge opportunity to close an inequity. And then also when we think about urban and rural disparities, again, the 5-minute response time for EMS is not present everywhere in the United States. So is there an opportunity where if you live in an area like I live, I'm way out in the country, it's quite likely that law enforcement would be able to get to me first while waiting for EMS to be able to make that response. So there's another area where there's huge gaps in outcomes for cardiac arrest, urban, rural. And one more area is thinking through panel B in figure 3 is really the thing that's like driving this for me is where do we have a lack of bystander CPR? And is there an opportunity to get law enforcement there first, especially in areas where either there's not likely to be a person present who can do CPR, or there might be hesitancy to perform CPR as a public responder? Law enforcement could potentially have a huge positive impact in those communities.
I would add into it too the opportunity here for dispatch code changes. I know a lot about EMS dispatching. I don't know a lot about law enforcement dispatching and what calls get priority and what calls don't get priority. So I'm not going to say that like it'd be an indication here to increase the probability or the priority of a cardiac arrest call. I don't know enough about that, but it certainly seems like getting the law enforcement officer to the scene, especially in some of the areas that you've mentioned in rural EMS, maybe it's more important that we get a bystander or a law enforcement officer there than in an urban setting where we know there's an ambulance 5 minutes away, or even dispatching. I mean, AI could tell you this, right? Your responding ambulance is greater than 8 minutes away. Thus, we're going to increase the priority of the law enforcement because they're bringing the high quality CPR person and the AED. I mean, it brings it drones and stuff like that could do it too, but AI could in essence tell you all about whether or not we need to increase the dispatch priority of a cardiac arrest call based on all these parameters.
Absolutely. For systems planning, there's huge implications there and related to community safety too, right? Do I need to run licensed siren to this if I can get law enforcement on scene with an AED to start the things that I would do as EMS anyway, and the things that are most associated with positive outcomes? Now, as we round out, we're getting towards the end. I want us to think though about the implications of if we take this, and I think the authors did a really interesting analysis where they looked at the opportunity for improvement. So they, in this population, law enforcement arrived before EMS 15% of the time, but applied an AED only 33% of the time. And if they were able to get this number up to 95%, let's say law enforcement for the times they beat EMS, they apply an AED 95% of the time, that's a 10 percentage point increase in AED application overall in the population, which is huge. And you can imagine what that would translate to for survival. So thinking this through, that is great. But I want to flip the script a little bit. And since we've got Michael and Bill and Jeff, you all do a lot more of the education side than I do. This is not without potential for harm and potential considerations that we should have if we do partner more closely with our law enforcement agencies and train in CPR and AED. I'd like you all to speak to a little bit what else would need to be in place when we consider training and the psychological implications of this.
I think we have to start with what training's already going into it, right? Are we training on in healthcare, we call this interprofessional partnerships, where we train the EMS with the ER staff or the ER with the ICU, or when we train a code team, it's interprofessional, right? We have lots of different people all arriving together and they have to work together. So if your agency is not doing this interprofessional partnership training, including law enforcement, I think there's a huge opportunity to do that. And again, the equipment stuff is all a side note of like who's responding, what cardiac arrest monitor, can you easily switch between your information? That would also, do some record keeping, right? We track our quality of compressions. Your AED on the law enforcement side probably does as well, but are we pulling that data? Are we evaluating for that data? Are we looking at it as a means for quality improvement? So I think there's huge opportunities to say, if the EMS agency is not doing the CPR training with the law enforcement, they should be, and there's probably an opportunity here to do some quarterly training, to say, okay, we're responding to a cardiac arrest, law enforcement, for the most part, is going to beat us there. Give them 3 to 5 minutes to start that training, and then EMS is going to arrive. Beyond just that we can improve some outcomes, we can probably work more efficiently together. So I feel like sometimes law enforcement gets to like hold the sailing bag, and you're like, there's probably some other things you could do if we told you how. And we did some training. So those are some of the things that come to my mind. And I'm thinking of all the services I consult with and work with, like, God, are we doing that or are we not? And do we have an opportunity here to do so?
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about the training aspects too. And CPR training is something that we're just seeing more and more commonly in schools, with teachers, with all types of different settings, not just police and law enforcement as well. But what can be an issue sometimes is police officers, they're all going through the police academy, check the box, good, they got their CPR AED training. There's not always requirements to keep that up. And I know from police officers who I've talked to that I work with, some of the younger ones who are fresh out of the academy are much more willing and able to do CPR because they feel confident with those skills, whereas others who do not recertify or don't keep up those skills maybe feel less confident and are less likely to actually engage in CPR. So I think this proves almost the importance of keeping up that education. I mean, as we could see in panel C with that bystander CPR, we know just how important that bystander CPR is. Great if it's a cop, but could be anyone who could really provide those benefits. So I think we need to make sure that it's not just a one-time training, but keeping it up. I think quarterly training, as you said, Michael, that would be great. That would be kind of the holy grail. I don't know about doing it that often, but definitely working together as a team to figure out, especially on some of these scenes where it might just be an ambulance initially arriving with 2 EMS clinicians, and there's not really a lot of manpower, not really a lot of hands. And sometimes police or other first responders might think EMS is there, we're good, we could step back, y'all got this now. But no, not quite. I mean, these folks are definitely well trained in CPR, know how to use the AED, and we definitely want to incorporate them in our full resuscitation.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, so I was going to jump in based upon my experience. So I was very fortunate when I went to work in '93 in Kansas that they already had established a police AED program with one of the departments there, and we grew it out of that. But I would say one of the first things is buy-in from the chief. The chief has to see this as a community service value, regardless of the folks in the field. If the chief isn't there and the chief isn't willing to budget the money and assign someone to it, that's going to be, so that buy-in there, I think, is really important. And then the EMS agency and in the shop that I worked at, the education division was the liaison with the police for all of the follow-up related to an AED deployment and CPR done by police officers. But over the 20 years that I was there, it really grew. And we were fortunate enough that they had an ABC schedule. So each shift, EMS shift, had a training officer to it. and that training officer there would always be a training officer on duty that could start the initial follow-up. But we also needed the operational battalion chiefs, EMS battalion chiefs, to help us with that, and lots of education. So it took educating everyone constantly, but we reviewed every AED deployment with the police and with the police officers that were involved. So that was part of the post-call review. That even before I got there, they were doing that, because they started with the AEDs that used to be on cassette tapes that caught all the audio recording and stuff. So it made for a very rich type thing. But I think the first buy-in is from the administration, the chief. Then you can go on from that and follow up with the other aspects that take place, that include the officers, training with the officers, the EMS, the local EMS crews working with the officers, the fire crews and EMS crews working with the officers. And then that follow-up is just really the post-call events, and everything is really important. And it constantly needs nurturing and growth. But since I know we're getting towards the end here, one of the things I want to make sure is this paper acts as a good foundation for an agency that's looking for a way to do a deep dive into the cardiac arrest into their system, because it's meaningful work. And if you can scrape together 2 or 3 more people a year in your community that are home, alive, and well, that's meaningful patient-oriented outcome. And then every year you're adding to your list only 2 or 3 patients at a time over the years, it's very powerful. So I like this paper. I like what they're doing, and I think it's a good role model. But there is a lot of work in this area, and those people who do this level of work and really dig into it can see how valuable it really is. And it's not a value that's always seen by everyone else.
I think that's really important, Bill, and I think I'm thinking too, when you're doing the after action report, how more motivational to a law enforcement officer than hearing like, "Hey, what you did actually made a huge difference in this patient," right? Because there are going to be those cardiac arrest saves, and I feel like sometimes in this we don't even find out about the saves, but our law enforcement counterparts probably hear even less. So the opportunity to get buy-in by sharing those results and being like, "Hey, this patient walked out of the hospital because of the work we did. And by the way, there's actual research that supports we all worked together and that made a better outcome." The other thing that made me think is this paper probably should be some motivation for the less urban settings, so rural and suburban settings, to say we need to make sure that our AEDs are on our police cars, right? If we know we have a longer response time because our providers are coming from home or we don't have staffing 24/7, then that should be our motivation to do that, right? Like in a setting where our response time is 3 minutes, maybe there's less of that need. I would argue there's probably still a big need there. But I'm thinking through my volunteer days and thinking, when we bought AEDs for the fire trucks, we probably should have included purchasing them for the squad cars as well, because it's probably not a high priority on the police department side to put AEDs and things. But if we can do the fundraising, or we have it in our budget to say everybody's going to be consistent, we're going to have the same AEDs as you do, the same pads, so everything's interconnected, that might move the needle on getting AEDs and more squad cars, because that's one of the limitations that the authors noted.
And just, I want to tag on to that. What we did is when we, as the EMS agency, since we bought the largest number of monitor defibrillators at one time, we negotiated a countywide contract. And so everyone could replace their AEDs. Everything stayed compatible because we looked at it as a system approach. So that allowed the FDs, the PDs, and everyone to update their equipment so it stayed very universal. The place where it wasn't universal was at the hospital. They weren't willing to play that game with us. So that always required a change, but we were able to manage that out of the field. But I'm going to go one step farther. I believe that in the whole chain of survival, we put too much effort on the stuff we do after the ambulance arrives. And I don't care if it's mechanical CPR stuff, ultrasound, heads up CPR, ECMO, whatever it might be. And I think we need to put more effort on recognition, telephone CPR, bystander AED, or who's ever first. And I have a vision of every AEDs just really should be like everywhere, and particularly, like you said, in volunteer communities, every volunteer member who responds from home, when I was doing that, that's how I started my career. I would have to drive past the scene sometimes to get the ambulance to come back. Wouldn't it have been better if I could have stopped, done the CPR, applied the AED, and I just really, the system approach, and this is where understanding the uniqueness of your system is valuable. But I think we need to put more effort on the front end, and I think the best kind of patient to come as an EMS provider to come to is the one that had CPR and was shocked and talking to everyone when I get there.
Absolutely. And I love that, we've taken a systems lens to this. The authors have done a great job at creating this type of thought-provoking piece. And, for those who are looking at this and thinking about, what does my system look like? How do I want to implement this? There's one more key point that I want to bring in before I send us for final thoughts and wrap up, and that it tends to get overlooked sometimes. And I think that is the mental health aspect of this. So if we are going to expand this out to police and have our officers perform CPR, that's wonderful. But what are we doing to take care of their mental health, especially since performing chest compressions maybe wasn't something that I signed up for. Performing medical intervention wasn't, something I had on in my mind and my expectations when I signed up for the police academy. So what do we have in place from a systems lens to support our officers and our other partners when it comes to, I had to perform CPR? Do we have peer support set up that can be accessed? Do we have somebody to check in on a critical incident? We talked about this being really valuable in rural settings. It's also far more likely that you're responding on a known person in a rural setting, which could be linked to a higher likelihood of a potentially psychologically traumatizing event. So I would just urge systems, as they think about this, not only thinking about compatibility with AEDs, but what about compatibility with our peer support programs, and making sure that after we have this, that we're feeding back the outcomes, we have the loop closure, we have that opportunity also to provide the peer support. So that's my soapbox for the day. I'll get off, but I will pass it around one more time for any last words, thoughts, areas that we'd like to see future study coming out of this before I carry us out. So I'll go around to everybody. Michael, starting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge, often overlooked segment there, Remley, that we need to consider. So I just commend the authors. This is great research and really sort of setting the tone on what good data collection can result with. So that's my big takeaway. One, we know that we can actually help more people now, but this is all because of the really great data collection that takes place in this system.
Absolutely. And Jeff, last thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. The data aspect is huge. Seeing those survival with good neurologic outcome, and like Bill was saying, being able to share that, I think can make this case even stronger for the value of getting those bystanders, whether it be police on scene, even in that couple of minutes, these short response times, they could still have a huge impact. So commend the authors again.
And Dr. Toon.
I certainly thank the authors and all of you for the time, and I really encourage, let's focus on the earlier parts of the chain of survival, and that will make our jobs on the ambulance and everyone else who comes later much easier.
Fantastic. And I will also echo the applause for the authors for taking on such an important topic, and taking the time to collect such robust data and publish it is really an important aspect of this. I think that this is a conversation starter. This has my wheels turning on where else might this apply? Where else might we have the opportunity to intervene earlier? And we think about things like having officers carry naloxone as another potential area for study. And I love that the systems approach and thinking, how do we get not even just buy-in, moving up St. Gates pyramid, we should probably get above buy-in and to commitment with our other community partners to provide better outcomes. So could not agree more with Bill on this one. Going upstream and thinking about where we can intervene earlier, likely to have a huge impact. So thank you again to all of you listeners, and huge thank you to the authors for taking this work on. I do have that unpopular task of wrapping us up and getting us ready for the next ones. So as a reminder, we have the Education Research Journal Club podcast later this month. It'll be Friday, May 24th. And then we're going to be back here with the clinical podcast second Monday of every month, same time. That'll be June 10th. Thank you all again for listening, and we look forward to catching you on the next one.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website, prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsors, Limmer Education, providing educational tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey, and ESO, dedicated to improving community health and safety through the power of data.